very warm welcome to our Professor Doyne Farmer, joining us from California, I think. So just a little bit about the theme. So what we're doing in this theme is exploring sustainable, stabilising and effective fiscal policy. So we've chosen this theme to align with our focus of our free stewardship reports the Treasury is publishing during 2025. Last month, we published a long-term insights briefing on sustainable and resilient policy over the economic cycle, and I'd encourage you all to visit the website to read it. The learnings from this series of seminars also informs our next long-term fiscal statement and investment statement, which will be published later this year. So these assessments are focused on a range of potential impacts on the sustainability of fiscal policy and how to manage various risks, spending trends, and the impact on our balance sheet. So speakers that we've invited to this series are providing insights into how fiscal policy can be designed to support government to meet its current and future obligations and adapt to changing circumstances and deliver value for the New Zealand public. Let me now introduce our speaker, Professor Doyne Farmer, who we're very excited to have with us today. So our guest is the Director of Complexity Economics program at the Institute of New Economic Thinking, and the Bale Guilford Professor of Complex Systems Science at the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment, University of Oxford, and the External Professor at the Santa Fe Institute and Chief Scientist at Macrocosm. His book, Making Sense of Chaos, A Better Economics for a Better World, was published in 2024 and promotes a revolution to make economic predictions more scientific. So today, Professor Farmer is going to talk us through how complexity economics and agent-based models can help improve prediction and policy making. For New Zealand, a small, open, shock-exposed economy, network effects bite harder than they do for most countries. So this approach will provide a valuable perspective to consider. And I'm sure that you're all aware after the COVID pandemic about how network models have been employed to improve our understanding of what's happening in real time to health outcomes. So for Treasury, today's topic offers us some ideas for upgrading our risk toolkit to better address tomorrow's challenges. So I'll now invite Doyne to deliver his presentation, which will be followed by a discussion. Please use the Q&A function in Teams and post your questions here. You can post them as we go, and I will moderate those questions for the professor. And if you have any technical queries, then please use the standard chat function. So thank you, and over to you, Professor Farmer. Warm welcome again.
Thank you very much. Let me get my slideshow running here, and hopefully everybody can see my slides and you can hear me. Let's see. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk today about my book that came out last year. So it's not going to be a very technical talk, but I'm going to allow plenty of time for questions. So please think about your questions as you go along, and we can dive into more technical details if that's of interest to the audience. Now, the book, just let me say a few broad things about the book, because I'm only just going to cover a few snippets of things that are in the book. My book's a first-hand account of scientific revolution in progress. I think that economics is on the verge of going through a big change, and I think I'm going to try and describe why I think economics is stuck and how it can change, and my book's about that story. There's lots of other topics in the book that I'm not going to cover today. I'm not going to talk about how you can use ideas from ecology to explain the economy. I'm not going to talk about how chaos explains business cycles. I'm not going to talk about why we have a financial system and why I think it malfunctions, or what caused the great financial crisis, or how we came to predict the weather and how we can do the same for economics. So I'll say a little bit about that. And I'm also not going to talk about the energy transition, but I'm open to answering questions about that as well. So bear that in mind when we get to the question section. To move along, let me begin by just recapping for everyone. And excuse me, I'm going to set my timer here to make sure I don't go over time. Let me recap how standard economic theory works. In a standard economic model, and I want to emphasize that I'm talking not about econometrics, where you make statistical models, but rather about theory, where you try and actually explain something from the ground up. And so in a standard economic theory, you first give each agent a utility function, which is a scorecard that describes their preferences or goals. In a typical macro model, for example, it would be that households want to maximize their consumption discounted over some time horizon. Then you have to give each agent a model of the world. The benchmark model is rational expectations, where agents can basically know the facts they need and can perform the calculations to optimize their utility function. Behavioral economics is exploring alternatives in which agents might be myopic or might have other things that prevent them from doing rational expectations. But so far, there's no universally agreed upon model. And in macroeconomics in particular, the rational expectations is still the core of all the workhorse models. Then you assume equilibrium, supply equals demand, and each agent selfishly maximizes their own utility. You write this down in mathematical equations to deduce the decisions that each agent will make that will maximize their utility, and then calculate consequences for the economy. So this basic format's been in place a long time, and I think it's pretty universal. Complexity economics provides an alternative based on complex system science. So you'll say, what is complex system science? I'll come back and say more about that in a minute, but I want to just start by giving you an example of a model that's different from the standard economic paradigm, a model that was used successfully to predict the economic impact of COVID on the United Kingdom. I'm showing here the pictures of the people who were on the team that produced the model. All of them are either my postdocs or ex-students or postdocs at the time the model was made, which it was at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. The model that we built, I should say, we actually didn't have this model built before the pandemic started. When the pandemic began, we realized that we could do something that might contribute. We literally worked on it around the clock because Penny is an Australian and she was in Australia. And so we would hand things off to her and she would work on it while the rest of us slept, and vice versa. So it was a very intense modeling project. The model successfully predicted the economic effect of COVID on the UK economy for each industry. We were able to test several different possible lockdown policies. We found one that we thought was least bad, which was to keep the upstream industries open and close customer-facing industries. I'll explain. It was least bad in the sense that it caused fairly minimal the fairly minimal economic harm, and the death rate was also not as bad because people weren't exposed as much as they would be in keeping the economy more open. We communicated our recommendation to the UK government. This would have been at the beginning of May or just before the beginning of May in 2010. And they did follow the policy that we recommended, at least for a while. They did some other things later on that I don't think were a very good idea, but I do think that choice was a reasonable one. And when the dust settled about a year later and we actually knew what happened, we were quite pleased to see that our model did very well. For example, in the second quarter of 2020, the GDP loss our model predicted was 21.5%. And in reality, it was 22.1%. So we got the course of the economic response pretty well. Now, how did we do it? Well, the model had two components. One is the model worked off of the input-output table for the UK production network. I'm showing a picture of it here. You see upstream industries on the left, like agriculture, fishing, forestry, downstream industries on the right, like client-facing industries, and all the size of the circles is the size of the gross output of each industry. The lines that you see are the input-output relationships of the industries. So, so our model actually predicted how the shocks from COVID would flow around in this 52 industry production network. The basic idea of the model was that industries can't produce if they lack labor, if they lack demand for their product, or if they lack essential inputs. And if they lack any of these, their output will be limited. So we assume there was a baseline output, which was their output before the pandemic began. And then we reduced their output as needed based on whether there were lacks of any of these three things. And let me just make a little comment about essential inputs, because that turned out to be something that's quite important. As an essential input, we defined as something that you couldn't produce the good without it, as opposed to other inputs that may not be essential. In fact, we found essential inputs by asking a set of industry analysts. At the time, I was a consultant for IHS Markit, a data company that had industry analysts in each of the industries that our model was covering. And we asked the industries, the analysts, a question, what are the inputs to this industry? And we gave them a list of all the inputs that had non-zero values that this industry can do without for 2 months and still keep production at the same level. So, for example, if the industry is steel, you can't do without iron. You have to have iron. You have to have labor to run the steel mill. You have to have industry to heat the iron ore up, and you have to have some impurities that you put in the steel to make it steel as opposed to just iron. But if you look in the full input-output table, other inputs are restaurants. Why? Well, because steel plants typically have cafeterias, or industry analysts, or sorry, not industry analysts, industry experts who advise on the industry, management consultants. You can get by without that for 2 months. So we had a list for each industry of what those were, and so we used that, and otherwise we used a Leontief production function, but only on the essential inputs. So to run the model, we initialized each industry with an inventory. We were able to find reasonable values for the inventories from government tables. And then we marched the model along day by day. And every day we'd ask how much each industry's output would be reduced by a lack of these factors. And of course, if the industries are affecting each other, because as you could see from my previous diagram, if an industry depends on inputs from another industry and that industry doesn't output as much, then the client industry's output may in turn be produced because they don't have the essential inputs they need. Now, to get this started, we had to make an estimate a priori of how big the shocks were going to be. And to do that, we made use of a remarkable data set that's compiled by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a bureau who, under the current government, I was just in a discussion about apprehension that the functions of that bureau are going to be gutted, but it was running strong in the time of the pandemic, and it contained useful information about occupations. For example, how close together do people in a given occupation work? So, as you recall, there was essentially a 2-meter requirement. We just assumed that if people worked more than 2 meters apart, they wouldn't be able to go to work. And if they worked, less than 2 meters apart, they wouldn't be able to go to work. And more than 2 meters apart, they would. And so we were able to produce a prediction about who would be able to go to work and who wouldn't. We had to map also provided by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, from industries to occupations, so we could see how much each industry was going to be affected by a lack of workers, make a judgment about whether it was bad enough that the industry would need to shut down. And you can see here, we were able to rate occupations based on the size of the supply shock and the size of the demand shock. That is, if you look in the upper right corner, occupations that essentially contains occupations that weren't affected by the pandemic, but you had occupations like airline pilots that were affected by a demand shock because airlines didn't stop flying during the pandemic. People just stopped demanding flying on airlines, or a supply shock, like where a supply shock happened because workers weren't able to go to work or because they lacked the materials they need. So we were able to estimate the shocks a priori, and we hit the model with the shocks, and then we let those shocks reverberate around by running our model day by day. And this picture shows what the outputs of the model looked like. You see time running along the horizontal axis. You see gross output normalized for each industry to 1. So 1 is the output pre-pandemic. And then industry by industry, you see colored lines corresponding to what our model predicted that industry was going to do over time. The solid black line is the aggregate output, and the black dots are what actually happened in aggregate terms. So you can see our model did a pretty good job of predicting the aggregate output. And you can see it's also making fairly specific predictions, industry by industry, about what each industry is going to do. Some of the industries, like you can see a blue line across the top at 1, that was an industry that was not affected by the pandemic. On the other hand, this green industry in the bottom was operating about 35% of normal output during the lockdown, and then slowly recovered after the lockdown happened. And you can see we did a pretty good job, at least on aggregate output. This shows a slice of what our prediction was, I think, a month into the lockdown, of how much so we show what actually happened to the data on the horizontal axis, what the model predicted on the vertical axis. So if we'd made perfect predictions, everything would have been lined up on the diagonal. You can see we didn't get things that right, but we did get things reasonably right. And there's a pretty good correlation between what we predicted and what happened. So the results were pretty good. Now, let me just say that since our original model, where, by the way, we put out our initial paper before the government actually made its choice in April of 2020. Then a year later, after we had the data about what actually happened, we wrote a paper, and in addition to showing what our predictions were and explaining how we got them, as we already had in the first preprint, we did a postmortem on what happened, and we did a lot of sensitivity testing to see what we did right and what we did wrong. And we concluded that we got a little bit lucky on a few things, but mostly the model behaved in a very sensible way. Things like understanding what the essential inputs was essential. If we used a strict Leontief production function, we predicted a much larger shutdown of the economy than what actually occurred. If we used a linear production function where there were lots of substitutions, then we'd predict a much milder hit to the economy than what actually occurred. So we managed to get the sweet spot. Now, subsequently, we teamed up with some epidemiologists and actually built a model that couples our economic model to their epidemiological model, again, so they can march through day by day and make predictions about things like how many people are sick in the workforce and won't be able to go to work as a result, and and actually models the feedbacks between epidemics and the economy. So I just want to stress that our model works very differently than the template of the model I described. There were no utility maximizing agents. We didn't assume that supply equals demand. Actually, the model didn't even have prices because all we were predicting was the reduction in output. But it was essential that the model was dynamic so that we could predict how the economic impacts would unfold as things went along. Now, okay, I mentioned complexity economics is applying complex thinking and methods to economics. So what is a complex system? Well, complex systems is the study of emergent behaviors. That is, when do we see situations where the behavior of the system as a whole is qualitatively different than that of its individual components? This happens when the interactions between the components are rich enough that the whole is dramatically different than just being the sum of its parts. You know, complex systems modelers have used techniques to do things like simulate ant colonies, simulate what's going on in neural nets, and many different areas. And one of the things we've discovered is you need to model things at fine scale. So a key tool in complexity economics is simulation. You mimic the system on the computer. The ABM is a simulation involving decision makers. We typically assume bounded rationality in one of several forms. And we also have the capacity to model the economy out of the equilibrium. We don't necessarily need to assume equilibrium, although it may be an emergent outcome of running the simulation. The example I showed you is a very simple agent-based model because actually there wasn't much decision-making going on. The decisions were really made by the production function that forced companies to shut down because they couldn't produce their good. But in a typical agent-based model has decision makers, and I'll come back and say more about bounded rationality, which is an idea that Herb Simon introduced in the 1960s. He argued that our reasoning capabilities are limited. There are many problems we can't solve. And so as a result, we resort to heuristics, rules of thumb, or myopic reasoning. We do the best we can and we plan ahead as best we can, given our finite cognitive capabilities. So, for example, to play chess, we use heuristics like control the middle or swap a rook for a queen if you can. And we use myopic reasoning like we think with those heuristics in mind, we look ahead a few steps to try and see whether we can make progress in advancing our position in the chess game by the options that are available to us. In agent-based modeling, we model behavior directly with bounded rationality. That can involve heuristics. It could involve goals plus imperfect learning and imperfect logic, or some combination of those. We could use learning algorithms. For example, we could even use things like machine learning or neural nets. We base the models on feasible information, and the key is we don't compute the optimal solution. That is, we might have agents who have something like a utility function that they're trying to maximize, but we don't necessarily assume that they're able to maximize it. And then we model the dynamics through simulation, as I said, that might or might not converge to equilibrium, and we model everything from the bottom up at the finest scale available. A strategy I advise is verisimilitude. That is, the goal is to model things as is rather than as if, to try and understand what are the basic mechanisms that the system follows and try and replicate those it doesn't mean modeling everything in slavish detail. One always needs to leave a lot out in a model. You just try and capture the essential features of the problem. Now, a key question that pops up is about what's called the wilderness of bounded rationality. I have several friends who are economists who described to me that when they were in graduate school, they told their advisor they wanted to build an agent-based model, and the advisor told them, no, it's a bad idea because you'll get lost in the wilderness of bounded rationality. The philosophy being that real people are complicated, and so I'm depicting in this cartoon the wilderness back there. You see the brains floating around. The people are heterogeneous. Real minds work in difficult ways that are hard to understand. So if you just try and do that, you'll get lost. And instead, you should enter the wilderness through what I call the rationality gate. And that is build a model based on rational expectations, and then try and add features to it to make it more realistic, add frictions to bring it closer to reality, but keep that gate in mind as you enter the wilderness. Sensible strategy. Let me just mention that many of we complex systems and agent-based modelers have actually entered the wilderness instead through the zero intelligence gate. We start by assuming that people are pretty stupid and just do things at random or follow very simple rules and that don't really require any intelligence. And then we add intelligence to the behavior sort of a step at a time and enter the wilderness from the other side. And there's even a problem I could say a little bit about in the question period where we've actually managed to meet in the middle, which I think is ultimately the goal. But just to say that I think behavioral economics has really emphasized that people have bounded rationality and that needs to be taken into account. Complexity economics is in transition right now. Since Herb Simon's day, we have computers that are 1 billion times more powerful. We have vastly better data. We have a better understanding of human behavior, a better understanding of how to build agent-based models, and a better understanding of complex systems in general. So I think the time is right to really make advances. Until recently, agent-based models, which started in economics in the late 80s, I mean, there's a few examples before that, but they were pretty primitive. But agent-based models have been qualitative models that model a generic economy at a generic point in time and try and calibrate the model to stylized facts, to try and reproduce stylized facts about an economy. But we now have several examples of quantitative ABMs where we study a specific economy at a specific point in time. We make quantitative predictions conditional on policies or other events, and we can evaluate the effect of the policies quantitatively. I want to stress that I think one of the biggest advantages of agent-based models is tractability, because standard models, because you're trying to find the optimal strategy where the agent actually maximizes their utility, the decisions for each agent that will maximize the decisions of that agent, keeping all the other agents into account or taking them into account, knowing that they're also finding the solution maximizes their utility. Whenever you have nonlinear interactions above 10 or so agents, typically much smaller than that, it becomes intractable. It becomes impossible to solve the equations. In contrast, in agent-based models, we use rule-based decision-making. We might even have learning algorithms, but nonetheless, the agents just make their decisions on the fly. They make the best decision they can. And that allows us to have millions of heterogeneous agents, and we can realistically include a much more accurate rendition of economic structure and take more features into account. Now, there, are now, there was a macro model that appeared about 4 or 5 years ago, led by Sebastian Paledna, where they used an agent-based model to model the Austrian economy. And Sebastian showed that it produced predictions that were comparable to those of a standard DSG model. We also have a version of our own where we've changed a lot of things relative to that original model. We can run multiple countries at a time. We did extensive tests. We ran 38 different OECD countries and compared our predictions to standard models and show that, well, first of all, we beat the Paledna model by a statistically significant margin. We beat AR models by statistically significant margin. We have not yet run the BVAR, about Bayesian value at risk, or test, but it's clear that we're at least in the ballpark. So this is starting to take off. We're actually having interactions with a consortium of central banks, including Bank of England, Bank of Italy, Bank of Hungary, Bank of Spain, Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada now is actually running a version of the Paledna model as part of their regular process. That is, they present the predictions of that model alongside the predictions of their DSG model and their econometric models. I want to just mention some other projects that we've done. I just described our global micro-macro model, and I'm calling it a micro-macro model because in that model, we model the economy from the ground up. That is, we model individual households and individual firms, and then we aggregate to get aggregate quantities like GDP. We have models for predicting technology costs and how technology is diffused through time. We have an energy investment agent-based model I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. We have an occupational labor diffusion model where, well, and actually we built on the results and knowledge we had from that model to do the COVID model that I mentioned. That effort was led by Maria Del Rio Chinona, where we look at the way workers change occupations over time when economic conditions change due to something like automation or the climate transition. And it's allowed us to think about where will labor be stranded and where will we get the labor we need. And we now have a version of that model that has geography as well as occupation in it. So it's a big network model where agents, we have, a certain number of laborers in each occupation, and they diffuse from occupation to occupation during a transition. We also have a supply network shock model that's actually a different version of the COVID model that I said. COVID was essentially a big shock, supply chain shock. And we've even built a simulation of the American stock market. So I can say more about these if people are interested. But I want to, I guess I'm going to say, just let me look here. This is not, okay, just a minute. All right, let me go back. All right. So let me look at my time. All right, I've got time. I want to make a little bit of a sidestep here to say a bit about the energy transition. I think that's something that's of interest to all of us. The picture I'm showing here shows the evolution of the Earth's energy system over the last 140 years. This was put together by my postdoc at the time, Rupert Way. And so we collected data from various sources. On the left, you see the cost of different sources of energy as a function of time. And on the right, you see how much energy we were using as a function of time. And so you can see that the different, maybe to start on the right side, you can see traditional biomass, which is that green curve. And by the way, we're plotting things from 1880 to, I think, 2020 in this plot. I need to update the plot, but no big surprises. The curves are more or less continuous. And we're showing useful energy production on the y-axis. Notice it's a logarithmic scale. So the transition from, one to the other, the changes are very large. And on this scale, exponential change looks linear. So you can see traditional biomass, which is the green line across the top. You see coal, which is the dashed brown line. You see oil and gas, the dashed black and gray lines. And you can see how coal and gas start out, several order of magnitude behind coal, and then catch up roughly in the 70s, and then began tracking along with coal. Why? Because overall energy use has been growing at about 2% per year across most of this period. You see other technologies like hydropower, nuclear energy, which is the pink one. It shoots up but then levels out. And then you see the renewable technology across the bottom, namely the orange line, which is solar, the blue line, which is wind, the purple line, which is lithium-ion batteries, the green line, which is green hydrogen. And so you see all those coming up at very rapid exponential rates. Strikingly faster than the rate at which the past technologies grew, with the possible exception of nuclear power in its early days. Now, on the left side, we see energy cost, and we see that the dashed brown line, for example, once again is coal, the dashed gray line is gas, the dashed black line is oil, and you can see that the cost of those energy sources, and in this case, actually, we're just plotting the price, so it's hard the costs are quite diverse and harder to track, but they haven't really changed very much in the last 140 years. That is, oil and gas and coal cost about the same now as they did within a factor of 3 or 4 to what they did 140 years ago. In fact, it turns out that's true for everything we mine out of the ground. Things we mine out of the ground all cost about the same as they did a century ago. In contrast, if you look at solar energy, the orange line, it's been coming down at 10% per year ever since it was introduced in the 50s. So solar energy now is a factor of 10,000 cheaper than it was when it was introduced in 1958 in the Vanguard satellite. Nuclear power has actually, the pink line has actually gone up. That's actually the price of US nuclear power. Internationally, it hasn't gone up quite as much, but it's still gone up. So you can see that these technologies behave quite differently. You can also see we're in a very special place because we have many different energy technologies that are all competing in roughly the same price niche. And but you can see that something quite different is happening for renewables. That is, they both have exponentially increasing usage and exponentially decreasing costs. And we have various models forecasting this that I'll mention now. This is, for example, forecast of solar module cost that Francois Lafond and I made back in 2013. You can see what's happened since. There's a few more squares that could be filled in, but roughly speaking, as I said, they're continuations of what's been happening prior to that. I want to stress that our forecast is not just a point forecast. We forecast the probabilities of reaching different price levels. And we've done this by doing experiments, forecasting experiments on 50 different technologies, pretending we're in the past, forecasting into the future, and testing a model that we developed that's a probabilistic forecasting model that actually gives us information about how good our forecasts are. This is our prediction for solar PV. This is now for diffusion, not for cost. We think solar PV is also going to grow fairly dramatically over the next 25 years. And now I want to jump to something else. with the time I have left, which I want to say a little bit about an agent-based model we're building of the energy and power sectors. In this model, the agents are real energy and power firms. So it's a one-to-one model, and the initial condition, at least, is based on energy firms that exist in the present world with their actual real assets. So every year, each firm may or may not invest to build new assets. We simulate markets to find the prices and quantities that each firm supplies, and we estimate the revenues and costs and profits of the firms. And we also make predictions about the future costs of the technologies along the lines I showed you a moment ago. We do this year by year, so we can actually look and see how the energy system will evolve through time. Maybe to give you, here's a picture of how the model works. We simulate energy markets. We estimate profits and losses. We use that to estimate investments, also looking at past investments. And we look and see the firms go bankrupt. We update our cost model, and we go around the loop. Now, so I will begin. I'm going to give you a little demo. It's a bit out of date already, but this is our model for Canada. So first, I'm going to show you how the Canadian energy system evolved over the since 1970 to, I think, 2020. So you can see the little drops are hydropower, the little gray flames are gas plants, those black things are coal plants. You see some nuclear plants down close to the US border. And so you can see year by year, Canada is adding facilities for its, and the energy system here is, I should have said, this is really their electricity system. We're also building a model for oil wells and gas wells, but that's not shown here. So this is how it looked in 2020. Now let's go to the next slide. Right here's our next slide. Now this is what our model predicts will happen going forward under without any carbon cost restrictions. So we can look and see how the mix of different technologies changes as we do that. We can then say, what are those companies going to do if instead there's a carbon tax of some form? And you can now look and see what happens. And you see conditional on Canada enacting carbon cost policy, you see a different outcome. Now, the thing I really like about this model is that we have a data set with a 30-year record of all the energy assets in the world, or 90% of them, and the ownership of those assets by firms. So we can see what happens, we can pretend to be in the past, and we can test to see whether we're making good predictions or not. And we're in the process of building that model out. We've been focusing on the Texas electricity system in particular because we have incredibly good data for that system, and because it's an isolated power grid, and our models are getting better and better. And I think my prediction is that within a few months, we're going to have pretty good predictions about how the Texas power grid, what the profits and losses of the companies that operate the Texas power grid will be, and that we'll be able to make some estimate of what their future investments will be and be able to study how that changes under different policies. Let me see. We're trying to build an integrated climate economics model with an energy investment model in the center, our micro-macro model, labor market model, putting all these pieces together in order to be able to simulate the economy as we transition through the climate transition. Let me just close by saying a little bit about the company I've started. It's called Macrocosm Incorporated. Our goal is to scale up complexity economics, reduce it to practice so that we can make predictions day in and day out. We're initially focusing on modeling the climate transition, but we have bigger aspirations down the line. we hope we can guide it to a better future. You know, our long-term goal is to do for economic planning what Google Maps did for traffic planning, namely to have a model that has every company in the world in it, that can make a guess about the input-output relationships between companies. It has demography in it to link populations and consumers and laborers, stimulating the economy at a fine grain so that any company can think about how to make its strategy better, more sustainable, and so that policymakers like you can run the models to try and find policies that can give you a good mixture of prosperity and sustainability. And I'll end on that note, hoping that you have lots of good questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doyne, for a fascinating presentation. I think it's great to have these sessions where encourages us to step out of our disciplinary boundaries and think about things from lots of different perspectives. We can tend to get, as finance ministries, get quite narrow and quite quickly. One of the things that I really enjoyed looking through the material from your book is the story that you tell about how the conditions that we have at the moment are really ripe for faster uptake of these kinds of modeling. So the extended data that we have and the computing power that we have. I guess one question I have consistently. Oh,
sorry, I'm being interrupted here.
Okay, we can give you a couple of minutes. I'm just encourage folks to continue.
I'm going to be switching rooms. I'm switching rooms. So excuse me. I will not be out of commission for very long.
Okay.
All right. Okay. And
while we wait for Professor to switch rooms, just encourage folks to continue to post material.
Yep,
in the
here I am. I'm back in action. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Oh, right. One of the things in your book that I thought was really interesting was how the conditions that we have at the moment are conducive to the greater uptake of agent-based models. In the past, we've sort of, post GFC and so on, we've had spurts of interest, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, how does uptake look now compared with 10 years ago when we were facing similar sort of problems with our models, like why isn't the financial system part of the macro model?
Well, I think several things have changed. One is 10 years ago, we didn't have quantitative agent-based models. Computers were slower, data was not quite as good. And so I think that's made a big difference because now if you're a central bank, you could run one of these models and really use it to investigate policies in a more quantitative way. I also think the time is right in economics more generally because there's a sort of cognitive dissonance in economics between behavioral economics on one side and rational expectations on the other. Models need to change to incorporate bounded rationality, and there's an open problem in economics of how to do that. Agent-based modeling offers a ready-made procedure for doing so. Well, I don't want to exaggerate it, ready-made in that we're doing it. It's not cookbook because there's a lot has to be put in. There's a lot of flexibility in how it's done. People are experimenting with different ways of doing it. But and let me also say that doing agent-based modeling to really do a better job in a quantitative way often requires a fairly big effort. you know, we really we need computer scientists to do the coding. We need experts on household behavior to inform that part of the model, experts on firm behavior. There's still the way the financial system is put into these models, I'm not very happy with. So there's a huge amount of work to be done. And I think to really make this work and realize its potential is a big job. But we're at a point now where at least we have models that are running, they're producing predictions, we can score them against mainstream models, we're doing reasonably well. And I think there's a lot of potential to do better so that we can actually beat mainstream models, but the jury's out.
That's really great. Just as a leaping point from that answer, there's about 3 or 4 questions in the chat that all get at the same sort of a question, which is, if you put yourself in our shoes as you know, with a level of practice that I think has pockets where we've used agent-based models in specific areas on transport and health to do specific problems, you know, what's your advice to us as sort of economic advisors and economic academics thinking about how we in practice, I guess, scale up our efforts in this area? And you know, what have you learned from working with others in the official community? What would your advice be?
Well, I want to make sure I understand the question. I mean, I guess, you know, there's a chicken egg problem because it requires some commitment and resources to build an agent-based model and do a good job. I think it's really important to hold back data to validate the model with, and not just estimate the parameters and put start. It really requires testing to make sure the model behaves sensibly. There's 2 different dimensions that one can test along. One is making predictions with the model, and the other is matching stylized facts. The goal is to really do both. I think particularly for doing counterfactual policy analysis, you want to match stylized facts as well as just making predictions. And you know, get the best people on your team you can, and make sure you have the resources to cover it. But I'm worried I'm not answering your question. Maybe you had something more specific in mind.
If we can maybe take a more specific question, I guess one question from St. John is, you know, one of the biggest challenge in these models is trying to calibrate them. And maybe you could talk about some examples with the models that you've built with other folks, either the COVID economic model or other models where, you know, you're trying to calibrate those with only partial data. How do you approach that calibration problem?
Well, it's been a significant challenge for agent-based models, and I think is one of the biggest reasons that has held them back in the past and created a block against building quantitative models. We've developed some methods for Bayesian methods for estimating parameters. My ex-graduate student and postdoc, Joel Dyer, has a paper where he's the lead author, and another postdoc from Oxford, Arnaud Carabofarol, is just releasing a paper on using automatic differentiation to make agent-based models calibratable, because you basically turn an if-else function into a sigmoid function and so on, so that the model becomes smooth, so you can use methods like gradient descent to fit the parameters of the model. So I'm just saying this to emphasize that this is something that the state of the art is changing rapidly right now. And in the paper that I mentioned, where we look at 38 OECD countries, part of the boost we had was by calibrating the parameters using Bayesian methods, which of course are also nice because then you have a distribution of possible parameter values rather than just a point estimate that might or might not be you just don't know how good it is. So it's a frontier, but I think it's becoming easier to do. I think, as I said, it's important to hold some data back so you can really validate the model and make sure it's behaving well out of sample. You need to keep in mind that predicting and identifying parameters are very different problems, that these models can often produce good predictions even when they can't identify all the parameters. And it turns out that's because in the space of parameters, if you think about the map from parameters to outputs, as you turn parameters, you can ask how much does the output move? And there are directions in that space where moving along that direction in the parameter space produces very large changes in the outputs. You better get those right. But there's other directions where you can change parameters a lot and not much happens. So stiff versus sloppy manifolds in the parameter space. And so this means that sometimes if you just get a few parameters right, you can make pretty good predictions, but you may not be identifying all the parameters, in particular the parameters that sit on the sloppy manifold may be very difficult to identify because they aren't making much of a difference in what the model does. And so maybe I'm going into too much detail in that. But let me just close by saying calibration, it is a big deal. Take a look at our papers about how we recommend to do it. It's been a challenge, but I think we're finally beginning to overcome it.
Excellent, thanks. I think there's a question here that's about the practicalities of introducing a sort of ABM model alongside our traditional sort of macro modeling approaches. I was really interested to hear in your talk that, there were examples already of central banking institutions trying to use this to build out their suite of models and inform their advice. Do you have any reflections on their experience to date with those, incorporating that sort of modeling approach into their decision making and building that model?
Yeah, the only example I know where it's actually incorporated into decision making is at the Bank of Canada. And I think they're the head of research at Bank of Canada is quite a booster. She's a co-author on one of the agent-based modeling papers. And they found it was actually, they introduced adaptive extrapolative expectations and found it was doing a better job of predicting inflation in the recent bout of inflation that we had. None of the other banks are actually using it in that way yet. In each case, there's a group inside the bank that's interested. They're experimenting with the model that we have and thinking about ways to make the model better. We're very keen to get funding so that we can build a proper platform to make it easy to add and modify modules in the model. Like right now, our code is, it's not particularly well-designed code. You have to be careful when you change something that you don't break something else. So we're very keen to refactor the model, and we want to design it so that we can do things like experiment with different tax policies. I think, the closer we can bring these models to producing reasonable outputs and being able to show to policymakers that we can often test policies that other models can't easily test, and the better our prediction track record, I think the more these models are going to start to catch on.
That's fascinating. One of the things I was interested in your presentations in your book is how the model's been applied to questions of financial sustainability and choices about how to turn off or turn on macroprudential sort of measures. Could you talk us through a little bit about your work on the housing market, its links with the financial system, and the work that you've done in the UK with their institutions thinking about how to apply that to decisions?
Sure. Yeah, the housing market model that we built was an effort that was funded by the Institute for New Economic Thinking back around 2009. And it was a simulation of the housing market in Washington, D.C. And we ingested a lot of data into it. So we had information from the IRS about how many people moved in and out of Washington every year, and which tax bracket and demographic category. We had information about mortgages in Washington, D.C. We had information from the Real Estate Association about all the houses that were bought and sold and what prices were bid on them at different. So we had a huge amount of information that we put together for Washington, D.C. Over the period leading up to the 2008 crisis and going past it. And then we built a model that, we had people in the model were either the household either rented or bought their house, and and we just simulated the way housing markets really work. We would decide how many people were going to sell their houses. They put the houses on the market. People would decide whether they wanted to buy or rent based on a kind of a myopic calculation about what the revenues would be and an extrapolation of housing prices. And then each household that was buying would try and find a house that matched what they wanted. We had a quality measure for the houses. The sellers would find a equivalent house, a house that closely matched the house that they had, mark up a little bit from what that house sold at, and then try and sell at that price. And then they couldn't sell at that price, they'd mark down by 5%. It's an example of a heuristic called aspiration level adaptation. That's how people sell houses. So we really tried to make it. Oh, and I should have also said, the buyers, this is key, the buyers, when they wanted to buy, typically would need to get a mortgage. We tried to match, again, demographics on that. And so they'd have to go to a bank, and the bank would look at their credit rating. And if their credit rating was good enough, they would give them a loan, and if not, they wouldn't. And then we were able to simulate the way banks changed lending policy leading up to the 2008 crisis, and show that made a huge difference in house prices. That as if we kept lending policy constant throughout the period, not much happened. On the other hand, and because in the old days, you would get in the US, you'd get a 30-year loan at a fixed interest rate. Very vanilla, and if you didn't meet the criteria, they wouldn't give you the loan. Whereas in the build-up to the crisis, they were giving away loans on much weaker credit scores and funky loans, with balloon payments and adjustable rates and all this stuff. And so we could really investigate the counterfactuals of what lending policy was doing, and we showed lending policy really made a big difference. No, we did. We subsequently worked with the Bank of England, and at the time, the Bank of England was in a housing bubble. We weren't allowed to say that word at the time. They didn't want us to say the word bubble, but that was what was happening in London. And they didn't want to pop the bubble, but they wanted to slow the bubble down. They wanted to basically to get housing prices to flatten out. And so they were investigating a policy that involved tightening the lending requirements so that you had to have a higher income to borrow the same amount of money. And we actually simulated, because our model would spontaneously make bubbles, we put it in the bubble, and then when the bubble was going, we would implement the policy, and we showed that the policy did pretty much flatten things out. Now, they implemented that policy. How much influence we had on the decision, I don't know, but I think we helped at least give them some confidence it was a reasonable thing to do. And models like that are now used in quite a few central banks around Europe. One of my ex-postdocs is at the Bank of Spain, and his job there is to run their housing model. And I think those models could be made much more realistic than the ones that are being used now. So it's a chance to really do something quite substantive. And it's also a case where the advantage is quite tangible because housing markets are markets that really don't clear. They're typically quite far from market clearing. You could see it both in the data leading up to the crisis. You know, if you were a seller, you could sell your house like that. And there were a lot of buyers who were frustrated and weren't able to buy the houses they wanted. And then when the bubble popped, the exact opposite happened. And we're talking about an order of magnitude on the two sides. And stimulating housing prices in the way we did with aspiration level adaptation really allowed one to see that supply-demand imbalance. Our model did the same thing that the real market did. We did quite a good job of predicting the supply-demand imbalance. So it was a good example of how actually capturing getting verisimilitude, capturing the way things really work, made a difference in the predictions of the model.
That's fascinating, Professor. We have a tiny bit of experience ourselves with housing, with housing bubbles. So, that's really fascinating. I've got a couple of questions here. I guess drawing off that question about data, really, I think. So one question is that comes from Paul is, you mentioned some powerful international data sets that underpin some of the models you've developed. Would you have any advice for data strategies for a small economy like New Zealand? And the second question from Bim is about whether is there a minimal data threshold that is needed, to use ABMs as an effective modeling strategy. So could you tell us about, examples of thinking about data and how you approach modeling?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question because if you want to build a quantitative agent-based model, you should think about data before you even get started and ask yourself, what data am I going to have to tell me that my model's behaving sensibly? In my experience, things you can't test, you probably shouldn't trust. And the key is to get as much microdata as possible. One reason I'm very bullish and optimistic about the energy model is because we really have detailed microdata about the things that the agents are doing. We have data about what each company did. We have data, we even have data in electricity markets every 15 minutes. What was the price? Who bid? What price did they bid at? And so on. So when it's really a great example of a micro-founded model that's micro-founded using microdata, where we can really, it goes back to your question about calibration and validation, we can test things at the micro level and make sure they're right, which means we can perform a lot more tests and therefore have more statistical significance in our evaluations of whether things are working. So it's essential, and it's usually the biggest stumbling block. In New Zealand, I think you have an advantage, particularly being at the Treasury. I'm guessing you have some pretty good microdata about how your economy runs. And you're being a small place, it's quite feasible. You should be able to run a one-to-one scale macro model for New Zealand with every person in New Zealand represented. Now, maybe you don't want to represent the real people, right, for confidentiality reasons, but you can build a synthetic population that I think can do a pretty good job. That's what we've done in our macro model. But we're not able to run it at one-to-one scale for most countries. But I would think for New Zealand, you could. And so it would be a very cool project.
Yeah, we have some good sources of data that we've invested in over time that is an infrastructure maintained by Stats New Zealand, which tries to integrate different data sources across administrative and survey-based data, which provides I think quite a rich source of information that could potentially be used for that. Could I ask you a little bit about turning to the energy modelling that you've done? Was this an academic project or a paid project, and how does it differ from, like, the workhorse models in this space are sort of computable general equilibrium models, and how would you compare the strengths and weaknesses of these different modelling approaches that you've used in the approach?
Yeah, let me first just make one brief remark that I have an ex-student, Will Scarrold, who's a New Zealander, and who's, I know a little bit about New Zealand data because he brought it to my attention at the time. But he's back in New Zealand now, and you might want to look him up and connect with him. But back to your other question about energy. So the energy model is a commercial model. We are trying to use the commercial potential to fund our work, because this work's typically very hard to fund. It's unconventional, and we need a big budget to do it right. So, and energy is a very ripe case because the data sets are quite rich, although they're not cheap. We spend more than $100,000 a year on data, but we can really see a detailed picture of what's happening. So I think it's from that point of view a very good test case. I'm trying to remember, you asked me something else about
what the modeling strategy, for policymakers in this area, like they're generally using some sort of computable general equilibrium approach to try and say, okay, if we raise carbon prices, what the hell happens to the economy?
Yeah.
So how does the modeling strategy sort of complement that or supplement it?
I mean, our models are less developed, but I think they have huge potential to really change the game because they're testable. The thing about a computable general equilibrium model is you're really asking the question of, what's the optimal, what would optimize people's utility, and CG models, attention in the field shifted to DSG models because you wanted models that would be more dynamic. But CG models have not had a good predictive track record. At least papers I found, the best paper I found was an Australian paper that did a test where they plotted predictions against actual outcomes, and it was this scatter plot. There just wasn't much of a correlation, which should be a warning flag that utility is limited. I mean, the traditional integrated assessment models that are the workhorse models in doing this they're asking the question of, if we had an omnipotent social planner who could just build stuff, what would be the least cost way to achieve a given climate warming target? So you decide on the warming target, and then you come up with a strategy to hit that target. And I think several problems. We don't have that planner. That's not what people have done. So at the end of the day, the models are not really testable because you can point that they haven't really predicted the outcomes that happened. They say, well, that's not even what we were trying to do. Whereas we're actually trying to predict what will happen. And we can backtest the model by pretending we're in 2010 and seeing how well it predicted what happened in 2011. And so I think that's a really big difference. Also, we can, we're not limited in the kind of policies we can test, and we can provide very granular advice. I mean, we can provide advice to a government that this is a good policy. We can provide advice to a company, this is a good policy. Here's a way to reduce your emissions and still make a good profit. One of my theses is that most energy companies have not yet realized that the energy transition is happening fairly quickly. It's an exponential transition. And I think we're about to really start to see the change happening. And I think the landscape is going to shift rapidly. And so this kind of guidance is going to become particularly valuable as a result.
That's useful. I've got a couple of questions in here, Professor, about communications. One, I think about like when you've got these models that are quite complex and agent-based, how do you use this effectively to communicate with the decision makers who are traditionally, I guess, more familiar with the aggregate level sort of modeling approaches? If you think about a Minister of Finance or a central bank governing board, they're very familiar with the sort of approaches that are traditionally used. And then I think in one of your talks, there's a whole bunch of questions from the academic economists about, you know, aren't these models a bit black box, and how do you respond to these sort of criticisms? So I wondered if you could just give us a précis of,
Yeah.
how do you communicate effectively with these models, and how did you become influential in particular areas like with the COVID? Are there any learnings from the COVID model about how you influence decisions?
Okay, so there's several different questions there. I think communicating, policymakers want to understand why something is happening. So you need to get a story. You can't just take your black box and run it and say this is the prediction. You need to tell them why the difference is there. And agent-based models are not black boxes because you can see inside them. You can see, if you want to, what each agent is doing, but you have to find a way of looking at it to describe things at the right level. Like, this is happening because households during the pandemic weren't spending their money, so they saved at an unusual rate, which meant when they emerged from the pandemic, they were going to spend all that money. So you're looking at individuals, but you need to aggregate things up in the right way to understand what the story is. And that's just very important. It's also important for yourself to make sure you understand what the model is doing. But it requires good software engineering to make that easy to do. You've got to build dashboards where it's easy to look inside the model and easy to diagnose what's happening, easy to run alternative scenarios by changing the assumptions, and even easy to simplify the model to find out what's actually making the difference. We've had several cases where we had a complicated model that was doing something and we went, why is it doing that? And so we started simplifying down to the essence to see exactly what was the piece that was causing the problem to happen. And that can be more work than running it to start with. On your question about communication, well, that was an odd one, actually. There was, in the United Kingdom, in those days, Boris Johnson was the prime minister, but he had a kind of a Rasputin who was named Dominic Cummings, who was very influential in the government, though his role was a little bit vague. And but Dominic Cummings, to his credit, he put out an ad for an assistant, and he said, my assistant should be reading these kind of papers. And the papers he was citing, a lot of them were from my colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute. So I got in touch with him and said, hey, what is your interest here? And we started a dialogue so that I had a channel directly to him. And he put me in touch with others inside the government so that we could communicate our results as they unfolded.
Very interesting. I have a couple of questions here from modelers about, how much of your code and is there a community of practice of ABM modelers where you're, sharing approaches, sharing code, sharing data that allows folks to, I guess, play with the models to learn what you're doing? And is there a way to connect with any of your colleagues on this? I mean, I think you've suggested our Kiwi colleague, Will, but is there a community of practice or an approach that interested modelers can connect with?
We're trying to build one. As I mentioned, we have a consortium of central banks, and we've given them our code, and they're playing around with the code and running it. everybody agrees that what we want to do is build a common platform so that we can share innovations easily and compare results. And the block to doing that is funding. We just haven't been able to get funding to make that happen. I'm actually here at a conference in California in hopes that I can get somebody to give me money to do just that.
Starting with the thanks is the right place, Professor.
Yeah. So, yeah, but we are in the process of putting the code on a open source GitHub so that anybody can download it. I'm a little worried because we don't really have the resources to maintain it. If everybody starts coming back and saying, "Hey, I found a bug," right now we don't have the resource to be responding to everybody, but we really need to be doing that. So we're going to put it out there and hope people will help us.
Okay. Well, I think we might wrap up the session there, Professor. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to share your insights with us. You've been tremendously generous and insightful, and I've learned a lot today from being with you. I want to thank everyone online for participation in the questions and also for joining our series. Just a plug for the next seminar that we have, which is next Wednesday, and we're going to hear from an old friend of mine, Mick Keane, who is the former director at the Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. And Mick is going to talk to us about how to future-proof our tax system in the face of rising fiscal pressures. It's great. Michael's going to be here for this seminar in person in Wellington. So please register. You can register on our website or versus Eventbrite. Now let me just quickly close our seminar today and farewell you all with the karakia. So, piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te wairua, hui e, taiki e. Thank you, Professor, and thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you on the flip side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.